But I woke up this morning and checked my toes, and I discovered that they're webbing. So, all right. If we're real lucky, the rain will stop by Monday. I heard, though, it's going to go through the middle of the week. So I don't get to say thank you for being here on this beautiful day. Just thank you for being here. We have some things to do before our lecture for today. Tanya has an announcement. You could stand there and project.
I just wanted to all let you know that student elections are going on today and tomorrow. The booths close at 7, and you can vote in the quad between Stevenson and where the cover is. And I encourage you to vote. We want a high turnout, and you'll be voting for, who will be your associate student president, your vice president, and your senator representatives for your schools. So I encourage you to go out there and vote. I just want to make that announcement. If you vote, you get a cute little sticker that says, "Kiss me, I voted," and you might get this.
Okay. We have started, the Human Rights Club and JUMP have started their efforts in the month of April in support of Darfur and the people who are experiencing genocide in Darfur. And Emily Pellin wants to make an announcement about some of the things that are going on. You got a flyer about some of the events. Emily?
So you all got flyers. We did start a Darfur awareness campaign. We just want to talk about a few of the events. You can see them all here. Every day from Monday to Thursday from 11 to 1, we are tabling outside of Stevenson. And you can buy these t-shirts that she has on. They come in a few different colors, and they're $15. We also have the bracelets, and they are $3. And all the proceeds, we're sending them to SaveDarfur.org. And
yes, and we have a couple really fun fundraisers because it involves eating. So the first one is going to be going on for the next couple of weeks, and this is at Baja Fresh. If you go to Baja Fresh anytime, weekday, weekend, and you say you're with the Human Rights Club, 15% of the proceeds go to our fundraiser, and we send them to SaveDarfur.org. Next week, we all know that Jerry Fowler will be speaking, and right following that, or anytime that day at Chevy's, we're also doing another fundraiser where if you go and say you're with Human Rights, you get 20% of the proceeds go. So those are fun events where you can get a big group of friends together and just go hang out and have a good time and eat, and still do it for a good cause. So maybe if you don't want to wear the t-shirt, or you don't want to have a bracelet, go eat, and we would appreciate it.
And if anyone's interested in volunteering to help with any of these events, or if they just have questions, there's an email address at the bottom, or you can come see me. I'll be here after class. And
we do have a Human Rights Club meeting tomorrow night at 7 p.m. at Charlie Brown, if anyone else is interested. That's it.
Thank you. And now we come to the subject of the day. It is my pleasure to introduce to you my colleague, Barbara Lesh-McCaffrey. We've worked together in the Holocaust Lecture Series for, 6 years. It's a real collaboration, and it's always nice to know that there's someone who you can rely on, and we can rely on Barbara. Barbara has her PhD in English from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. She came to Sonoma State in 1980 and worked as affirmative action officer, not director, officer.
I was actually director of, but...
Director of affirmative action. Something that's very much on the radar now that the Women's Resource Center and some other things at the student union are under threat. She began teaching full-time in Hutchins in 2000, and she told me, I'll tell them the rest about me. So it's with great affection and pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks, Myrna. It's great with great pleasure and affection that I introduce you to Barbara.
It's hissing. It's not hissing now? Okay, great. I thought trying to have Myrna fill you in on what it is that prepares me for this talk would take longer than me telling you. And one of the things I've learned since coming to Sonoma State is whatever it is that I knew before I got here keeps on changing and morphing and expanding. And while my academic training is in, believe it, modern British and American poetry, it's the thing I teach the least. And I found myself in an interdisciplinary program. I've actually been teaching in anything that sounds interdisciplinary at Sonoma State since I got here, having taught briefly in the English department for about 10 years, and then teaching in women's and gender studies, ethnic studies, global studies, and Hutchins, and also in the freshman seminar program. I'm very glad not to have a schizophrenic existence anymore, and I now teach just in sociology and in the Hutchins program, which means I teach about anything and everything. My interest in the writing about the Holocaust actually started back in the 80s when I started exploring Jewish women's writing, and from there when I started getting involved in the Holocaust lecture series, looking at the writing of survivors, and in particular in the last few years, looking at the experience of children who are hidden. And so you'll find more examples of that than anything else in today's lecture, because that's the thing that most interests me. And I got a chance to give a presentation on it this past summer at a conference on women and the Holocaust in Krakow in Poland. So it's kind of near and dear to my heart and interest. But today we're really going to do a kind of tour de force looking at a vast variety of voices over the period of time, because this year's lecture series is really focusing in on, if we remember, past, present, and future. So we'll be starting in the past and moving forward. The primary focus is on Holocaust literature. We'll be looking at diaries and letters of those who did not survive the genocide of the Jews, as well as poetry, fiction, and nonfiction by those who survived the camps and ghettos, by those who survived by being hidden or by passing as non-Jewish, and by those able to escape before the doors closed. We'll also be exploring the works of those who were alive in other countries during the war, and the subsequent generation of writers, including those of the children of survivors. The focus for today will be on the Holocaust, and at the very end, I'll make some allusions to the writing that we're beginning to see about other genocides in the 20th and 21st centuries. Lillian Kramer, in her introduction to Holocaust literature, an encyclopedia of writers and their work, speaks of it as a literature of witness and mourning, which explores the trauma of its implication on post-war thought. Another critic, Alvin Rosenfeld, in his essay on the problematics of Holocaust literature, says that Holocaust literature extends so far as to force us to contemplate what may be the fundamental changes in our modes of perception and expression, our altered way of being in the world. Noted feminist scholar Susan Gubar reminds us of the injunction of Theodor Adorno, a Jewish philosopher and social critic who left Germany in 1934. In his view, works of any artistic configuration were doomed to distort the harsh experience of victims and survivors, constituting some kind of disfigurement of the truth. In 1949, he said, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric." And that's probably one of the most famous statements about Holocaust poetry that you'll come across. He feared the trivialization, I think I got that right, trivialization of the Holocaust, but later modified his initial position and said, "Perennial suffering has as much right to expression as the tortured have to scream. Hence it may have been wrong to say that no poem could have been written after Auschwitz." In her study of poetry after Auschwitz, Gubar says that despite the difficulties of knowing how to speak of the dead, how to speak to the dead, how to speak for the dead, what the dying of the last Holocaust survivors at the turn of the century teaches us is the necessity of keeping the Holocaust alive, now through the exertion of those who have never struggled with its ghastly regimes. That's us. For her, poetry can promote mindfulness about how the past continues to exist as outrage in the present. And I'd add, how it helps us grapple with genocides that have happened on our own watch, as that wristband says, not on our watch. Many of those who write about Holocaust literature speak of its power to counteract the silence, as the voices of those who experienced it directly have either faded or not survived. As Gubar says, for those of us attempting to acknowledge irreversible losses, poetry refuses and refutes a silencing which would constitute a victory of the forces of evil. The work we are about to sample, letters, diaries, memoirs, essays, poetry, and fiction, can teach us how to inhabit, at least momentarily, events in history that we can neither escape or transcend. Please join me on this journey in which we view images and hear the words of those whose words add, and I hope amplify, those of the scholars and survivors that we've explored so far. My hope is that these fragments and poems will amplify your understanding of the impact of genocide and compel you to act when you see injustice, just as Lillian Judd asked us to be mindful. Jot down the themes you discover in these works and your questions so we can discuss them a bit at the end of the presentation and in sections on Wednesday and Thursday. This is a somewhat chronological view, so we're going to start first with the voices of those who didn't survive. Most of us know about Anne Frank. How many of you had ever heard of Eddie Hilsum before you read the material in today's reader? 2? Okay. Eddie was born in 1914 in the Netherlands. Her mother had fled the pogroms in Tsarist Russia and fled to the Netherlands in 1907. Her diaries describe the intensified isolation and segregation that Dutch Jews experienced while awaiting their impending deportation to concentration camps in Poland. Over 82% of the Dutch Jewish population were, of the 82%, only 5% survived. So 82% were deported, 5% survived. Unfortunately, Hilsum was not one of those who did. What makes her work so unusual and so hard to place is that her journals show that precisely when the Nazis closed in on her, Hilsum managed to gradually liberate herself from fear and hatred to the point of complete understanding and acceptance of what was to come. This is an excerpt from one of the diaries. Very well, then, this new certainty that what they are after is our total destruction. I accept it. I know it now, and I shall not burden the others with my fears. I work and continue to live with the same conviction, and I find life meaningful. My life has, so to speak, been extended by death, by my looking death in the eye and accepting it, by accepting destruction as part of life and no longer wasting my energies on fear of death or the refusal to acknowledge its inevitability. It sounds paradoxical. By excluding death from our life, we cannot live a full life, and by admitting death into our life, we enlarge and enrich it. And these are views of Westerbork, which was the transit camp. The voices of those who survived include probably the most famous writers that are part of the kind of, for those of you who are English majors, canon, the people we all study. Elie Wiesel. How many have read Night? Paul Celan. How many read Todesfuge before today? And we'll also be looking at Primo Levi. The selection from Elie Wiesel that I'm including today is not in the reader, but it's a short one, and I think you'll get it on the screen pretty easily. He was born in an area in northwest Romania. When he was 15 years old, he and his family were deported to Auschwitz, which was in 1944. And at the end of the war, he was part of a group of orphans from the concentration camps who were taken to France. While insisting on addressing the Holocaust in its specifically Jewish dimensions, Wiesel has argued that the legacy of the Holocaust compels one to intervene on behalf of victims worldwide, particularly those threatened by state-sponsored persecution. This is an excerpt from Night. Many of you who've read it, it talks about the instance where his father is beaten and dies, and I really want to focus on the next slide. Give you a second to read this. There were no prayers at his grave. No candles were lit to his memory. His last word was my name, a summons to which I did not respond. I did not weep, and it pained me that I could not weep, but I had no more tears. And in the depth of my being, in the recesses of my weakened conscience, could I have searched it, I might perhaps have found something like free at last. And that free is obviously the description for his father, not himself. And these were some of the barracks bedding in Auschwitz. Primo Levi's family belonged to a small and largely assimilated Jewish community in Turin in Italy, whose roots go back to the Sephardic community. Those are the Jews who ended up being expelled from Spain. And we talked a little bit about the fact that there are two primary languages that are used. We've heard a little bit about Yiddish. The language that's used by Jews of Sephardic background is called Ladino. It's a combination of Hebrew and Spanish, just as Yiddish, which we're going to hear a couple of words of shortly, is a combination of German and Hebrew. With the fall of fascism in 1943, Italy's armistice with the Allies in September of that year, everything changed for Levi, and he joined the armed resistance against the Nazi occupiers of northern Italy. Unfortunately, he was betrayed almost immediately. Preferring to declare himself a Jew rather than risk execution as a partisan, which is kind of interesting that he felt it was safer to be a Jew in that circumstance than to be a resistor. He was deported to Auschwitz and sent to work in a satellite camp where he remained until being liberated by the Red Army in January of 1945. Having been left behind and not taken on a death march because he was dying of scarlet fever, but he was able to survive. And this is from Survival in Auschwitz. You who live safe in your warm houses, you who find, returning in the evening, hot food and friendly faces, consider if this is a man who works in the mud, who does not know peace, who fights for a scrap of bread, who dies because of a yes or a no. Consider if this is a woman without hair and without name, with no more strength to remember, her eyes empty and her womb cold, like a frog in winter. Meditate that this came about. I commend these words to you. Carve them in your hearts at home and in the street, going to bed, rising. Repeat them to your children, or may your house fall apart. May illness impede you. May your children turn their faces from you. What Levy is using here is the melody and wording of an ancient prayer about teaching your children the importance of their religion. He's just turning it around and using different words for us to focus on. So rather than put the teaching of God's word on a signpost on your gate, it's carve them in your hearts and repeat them to your children in case this impending evil would result in them losing their connection with you and their beliefs. We've probably already seen some of these views of Auschwitz. And the work makes you free. See if the technology worked for us. Over the entrance gate. If there's one poet that has really been the key figure whose work we read about the Holocaust, it is Paul Celan's Todesfuge or Death Fugue. Celan was born in an area that used to be Austria and that now is part of Romania, into an assimilated family that was relatively observant in 1920. And in 1940, the area that he lived in, called the Bukovina, was occupied by the Russian army. In 1941, the Romanian fascist troops reconquered the area, killing thousands of Jews within the first 48 hours. Anshel, his given name, who recognized the looming danger, went into hiding but couldn't persuade his parents to join him. His father died of typhus in the camps and his mother was shot. He was sent to forced labor in a Romanian labor detachment. Like the poets in his homeland, Celan defiantly continued to write poetry in German, in spite of his traumatic experiences during World War II, and the fact that he lived in a non-German linguistic environment. He wrote in German. He confronted the dilemma of being a victim of the Shoah and a poet writing in the language of those who murdered the Jewish people. Todesfuge again captures the rhythm of a prayer that would be well known to those who were even non-observant Jews, because it's the prayer one says about death. And if someone dies in your family, you're obliged to say it every day for a year. So it's something that's very much part of the fabric of Jewish life. It would be very familiar. And the death fugue is Ceylon's death poem. It's Kaddish for his murdered parents and the victims of the Shoah. And while we see it on the screen, I've got a recording of Ceylon reading the poem in German, and we'll follow along in English. And this is just a little introduction in German.
Ich hörte sagen, Gedichte und Prosa von Paul Celan, gelesen vom Autor.
Todesfuge. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken sie abends, wir trinken sie mittags und morgens, wir trinken sie nachts, wir trinken und trinken. Wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt nach Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er schreibt es und tritt vor das Haus, und es blitzen die Sterne, er pfeift seine Rüden herbei, er pfeift seine Juden hervor, lässt schaufeln ein Grab in der Erde. Er befiehlt uns, spielt auf nun zum Tanz. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich morgens und mittags, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt nach Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit. Wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Er ruft, stecht tiefer ins Erdreich, ihr einen, ihr anderen spielt weiter zum Tanz auf. Er greift nach dem eisernen Gurt, er schwingt, seine Augen sind blau. Stecht tiefer die Spaten, ihr einen, ihr anderen spielt weiter zum Tanz auf. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags und morgens, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit, der spielt mit den Schlangen. Er ruft, spielt süßer den Tod, der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Er ruft, streicht dunkler die Geigen, dann steigt ihr als Rauch in die Luft. Dann habt ihr ein Grab in den Wolken, dann liegt man nicht eng. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags, der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Wir trinken dich abends und morgens, wir trinken und trinken. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland, sein Auge ist blau. Er trifft dich mit bleierner Kugel, er trifft dich genau. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er hebt seine Rüden auf uns, er schenkt uns ein Grab in der Luft. Er spielt mit den Schlangen und träumet. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit.
In this poem, the milk, a symbol of nourishment, whose whiteness denotes purity and innocence, is black, suggesting the idea that the speakers in this poem no longer drink milk, but death. The poem explicitly references the atrocities in death camps and the sadism of the perpetrators who forced some of the victims to sing and play music and others to shovel their own graves. The juxtaposition of the name Margarita, invoking the Faustian German tradition, to the name Shulamit, which stands for the Song of Songs, discloses the abyss between the German and Jewish cultural traditions, between Nazi perpetrators and Jewish victims. The poem leaves us with a question. What might it mean to be transported out of this horizon of fear after having been branded for death as a child? How does one continue to live after this experience? Dan Pages is also from the Bukovina and was born in 1930. He'd experienced severe disorientation and loss even before the Holocaust when his father emigrated to Palestine and his father died not long after, and his own deportation at the age of 11. Pages' family in Bukovina had been convinced that his father would be unable to support him, and because of this, they did not bother to try to even send him to Palestine, and he thus remained among those Jews who were swept away by Nazism. He was incarcerated for 3 years and spent his early adolescence in concentration camps in Transnistria, which is the territory now part of Romania, where most of the Jews from that area were deported. For me, his very brief poem has enormous power. Written in pencil in the sealed freight car. Here in this carload I am Eve with my son Abel. If you see my older boy Cain, son of Adam, tell him that I... Would you take a second to write down your responses to this? Just grab a pen, scribble on your piece of paper. If you're in the class, write it on the back of your attendance form. If not, you can write it on the back of the sheet with the events in Darfur. In what way does this poem relate to the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel? I'm going to read it again while you're thinking. Written in pencil in the sealed freight car. Here in this carload, I am Eve with my son Abel. If you see my older boy Cain, son of Adam, tell him that I... I know it's often difficult to share in large groups. And I know that because I read all of your responses last week to what was working and what wasn't, and a number of you said it was okay to talk in section, but it was real hard to ask questions in lecture. But is there somebody who might be brave enough to share what you wrote? There are no wrong answers. That's the nice thing with poetry. Christine?
Well, when I read this on the reader, at first I thought, is that a typo? I was like, wait, you didn't finish. And the only thing I could think of was, Cain is the killer. And in this circumstance, there's Eve and she's with her son, Abel is still alive. And Cain is the killer, so what would she say to her older son, the killer?
Yeah. So the poem isn't finished, and you thought maybe Cain, her older son, might have been the killer, so what does she say to him? But you're right.
Well, it seems like she's referring to just humanity in general here, and the fact that we're all human beings, and yet the Germans are kind of killing what we consider their brothers. So in this particular context, I consider Cain to be a representation of the Germans killing Jews as able.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have something different? Yeah, Tanya.
Instead of the analogy to being able from Adam and Eve, I was thinking that because he's in the Holocaust, and he's constricted, his everything, his humanness, he doesn't even have the ability to write poetry and express. It's like everything that measures him as a man has been taken from him.
I think it's also that Abel, the reason Cain was jealous of Abel was because Abel had God's favor. So I think it does have a lot to do with the fact that he was Jewish, and Jewish are the chosen people, and it has a religious aspect to it.
Yeah.
I was thinking that the reference to Eve might be because she has the knowledge of both, or he has the knowledge of both good and evil, what's happening, and that to Abel to spend his with her is innocent and is going to die with her, and Cain's not with her because he's working in the camps. And maybe she's trying to tell him that she understands why he's doing that.
Do you notice how much we got out of so few words? When I read it, what I see is a woman who's been separated from her husband and other son, trying to get a message to them. And we know how grim the circumstances were on those cattle cars, and how it is unlikely that people survived them. It's also telling that the message is never finished. Tell him that and most of us would try to put little dots there, those cute little ellipses, that fancy terminology, for the thought never got finished. She's begging a existing audience, us, to deliver the message that she won't live to complete. I did some research on this one. I found a very interesting perspective, and that was that there are 23 syllables in this, comparable to 23 chromosomes, or half of that double helix. So, in essence, this is half a family separated. And we know how frequently families were destroyed in the Holocaust. For me, this poem packs so much in so little, and it's so accessible to all of us. You don't have to be a PhD in modern poetry to get it, right? Did all of you get something when you read it? Get some inklings? I think a lot of us have been taught in ways that I wish weren't the case, that poetry is inaccessible. And one of my favorites of all the courses I ever taught was the first one I did, which was Guerrilla Skills in Reading Poetry. It was an extension course when I was a graduate student. So I'll hope you come back to Dan Page's. His stuff is very, very available. But I want to move on to the voices of those who were hidden. And the first person is Ida Fink, and for those of you in the course, we've read some of her very brief short stories. She was born in Poland in 1921 to an educated professional family, well integrated into Polish culture. As secular Jews, they had not a strong sense of Jewish identity. They had a strong sense of Jewish identity, but were not religious, which is very typical also of assimilated Germans during that time. Although Fink did not look identifiably Jewish, being fair, blonde, and blue-eyed, and in some ways this picture gives you a little glimmer of that, she did not attempt to hide the fact that she was Jewish. As anti-Semitism increased, it became important to her to assert her Jewishness, to tell people she was Jewish. Her family resided in the ghetto in Lwów in Poland, and she and her younger sister left together using false identity papers and survived the war in hiding. She's explained that the events detailed in her stories actually happened, that they are authentic and true stories about her own life and the lives of people she knew during the war years. But she chooses to write fiction rather than autobiography, memoir, or reporting, in part because fiction is a genre in which she feels most comfortable. It's a vehicle that offers her some distance, and we know from some of the survivors we've had come in, sometimes it takes them 40 years of distance to be able to even begin to talk about their experience. These very short stories present slices, one might say, slivers of life under the Nazi program of genocide. Many of Fink's stories isolate the moment when the world unravels, the moment, that is, that one realizes that Nazism has radically changed the nature of things, or the moment when one knows that death awaits imminently. And this is a selection from that short story that really has no title. It has 5 stars. Hidden in the dark interiors of apartments, with our faces pressed against the window panes, damp from rain and from our rapid breaths, we reprieved until the next time, looked out at the condemned who stood in the marketplace, in the same spot where on fair days the cheerful town erected its stalls. Divided into groups of 4, they were waiting for the command to set out, and the rain kept falling. It didn't stop for 1 minute that night, a night that those who survived will remember as the night of the old men. It was then the old men of the town were already on their way and were passing their homes, and the children and the grandchildren hidden behind the windows. It was then that the door of one of those houses opened, and we saw a woman running across the marketplace. She was thin, covered with a shawl, carrying her huge pregnant belly in front of her. She ran after those who were walking away, her hand raised in a gesture of farewell, and we heard her voice. She was shouting, "Sei gesund, Tata, Tata, sei gesund. Be well, Papa, Papa, be well." And then all of us, hidden in the darkness, began to repeat, "Sei gesund," bidding farewell with words to our loved ones who were walking to their deaths. And these are images from the Lvov ghetto. Am I going too fast or too slow? Too fast? Just right? Good. You know me, I get enthusiastic. There's a lot I want to cover. If I could share another 30 of these with you, I would, but I don't think I have that many left. Roma Lagaka this section is not in the readings that I gave you. She was born in 1938 in Krakow, the daughter of Jewish parents. She grew up in the Krakow ghetto and had a red coat, a gift from her grandmother that she felt saved her from death. And very different from the girl in the red coat in Schindler's List. A number of you saw Schindler's List, and you know it's almost exclusively black and white, except for the time with the girl in the red dress. It turns out, the red coat, turns out lots of little girls had red coats. It was not uncommon. And this is a contested text, in part because she was so young that others have felt that she's making stuff up. I found it very interesting that the person who attacked her the most was her very own cousin, Roman Polanski. You might know Polanski because he was the person who wrote The Pianist, a film many of you have gotten to see. And so there's interesting friction and tension. But I think even with young children, there are important memories that continue. And what she said was, this was in an interview, For a long time, Holocaust researchers assumed that the few children to survive were too small to remember. What she said is it's not true. All of the details are branded in our memories, like a cattle brand. We were never asked. Many remember the atrocities and abuse they experienced at this tender age, but most avoid addressing them. And this is one of her memories. I can still hear the stories the grown-ups told. I won't ever be able to forget them. And this is, she was hidden during the war, and this is when people came back after the war. It didn't help putting my hands over my ears, creeping under the bed, or pulling the blanket over my head. There was no escape for us children. They had no pity on us. We were turned into involuntary witnesses by those who were bearing witness. As soon as it got dark outside, the grown-ups would begin to talk about all that they had lived through, about death, about unimaginable atrocities, about tortures, the agonies human beings are capable of inflicting on fellow human beings, and that their victims are able to endure. This was the time for lamentation and for grief, the time for anger and bitterness. After that, the voices of the survivors fell silent, many of them for all time. And our generation, the generation of their children, we too no longer spoke of it. And we'll come back to this, the very end, when we look at a little bit of Hayuda's engagement party. Yeah.
Why did she say she was saved by her grandfather?
In part because of the non-Jewish family who felt sympathy for this lovely little girl with her strawberry red coat and took her in, and her mother. So sorry I left that. That's a good detail. These are some of her paintings influenced by her experience in childhood. Robert Nelson is somebody those of you in the course will meet very shortly when we do some readings about the Armenian genocide, and he is a scholar of the Armenian genocide, but he was also a hidden child. And I find his work as a hidden child infinitely more compelling. He was born in Warsaw, in Poland, in 1937, and by sheer chutzpah, or pluck, if you will, and bravado, his mother acquired the identity papers that would disguise her, her husband, and her son for the entirety of the war. The Mendelssohns became not just ordinary Polish Catholics, but a Polish family of noble lineage. So they went from being, if you will, middle-class Jews to nobility. Armed with their new lives and their new pasts, the Count and Countess and their son, Count Bobby, took shelter in the shadow of the Nazi machine, hiding day after day in plain sight behind a facade of elegant, good manners and cultivated self-assurance. Nelson's father took advantage of his flawless German to build a lucrative business career, not unlike a Schindler. The family acquired beautiful homes in the German quarters of both Krakow and Prague, where they had maids and entertained Nazi officials. Not your typical hiding story. And this is a photo of Nelson and his mother. They hid this so well that their son didn't know until after the war that he was actually Jewish. And this is a segment from his memoir in which he finds out. It was nearly comical, if the implications had not been so dreadful, that the very false papers, the phony birth certificates, and the Ken carton that had saved our lives during the Nazi occupation now threatened us with deportation once we fell under Soviet rule. My parents thought of burning them, but they were the only identification we had, so we soldiered on, me obliviously, as Zamaskis. Bogusi, there is something you must know, said Tatusi, while he glanced toward my mother. During the war, yes, well, during the war, and here my father began to grin broadly, and my mother suppressed a nervous giggle. Well, during the war, people do some strange things, right? Sure, I try to go along with what seemed to be a joke, or at least a funny story. Oh, what the hell, said Tatusi, as he pushed off the windowsill and sat himself at my mother's feet, on their bed. Bogusi, you're a Jew. What? So I'm Jewish, I thought. Without knowing what that meant, except, hadn't we killed Jesus? I looked up at the faces of my parents and realized that their smiles were those of chagrin and not of pleasure. It was almost as if the revelation of our true identity, which they had tried to pass off lightly, as almost a prank, had not been convincing. It was a joke. It was a joke that had gone too far, and they seemed embarrassed by the result. As for me, the unintended butt of their prank, I felt confused, but also to some extent relieved at finally being included in the secret lore of my parents' lives. So many things suddenly became clear, and for that inclusion, I was willing to trade, for the moment at least, to trade Christian for Jew, Zamoski for Mendelssohn. Quite interesting for a young child who, during the war, was involved with other young kids in taunting Jews to find out that he was Jewish. Perhaps the most compelling memoir that I have had a chance to read is that of Magda Dennis. And her book called Burning Castles described how her family, Hungarian Jews, survived the war. She was 5 when the war began. Her father, the publisher of an anti-Nazi newspaper, fled to the United States in 1939, taking the family's money, leaving his wife to care for Dennis and her adoring older brother Ivan. With no money, he had it all. The book describes the family's narrow escapes from Nazi detection, the various hideouts where they stayed once Jews began to be rounded up, and the tedious activity of survival, as she describes it. The book describes Dennis's terrible sense of abandonment when her mother left her repeatedly in supposedly safe houses, while the rest of the family hid elsewhere. And her story takes place on opposite sides of the river that cuts through Budapest and separates Buda and Pest. She speaks of loneliness. Loneliness is always spoken as if a matter of lack, but loneliness is also a condition of surfeit. It is too many runaway thoughts, too great a pull of gravity, too much attraction to the grave, too many shadows that turn into shades, too full a moon on which to wish in vain. Loneliness is a tombstone hung around your neck to carry until the day when at last it can be laid to rest above you. She also talks about fear. When you come down to it, fear is an entertaining emotion. Not our usual perception, right? It keeps everything inside you buzzing. It keeps you taut, tingling, alert, prepared to jump, ready to invent lies, set to overcome odds. Fear contains in itself possibilities of the spectacular. But the most pervasive emotion in me was not terror. It was disbelief. How could all this have happened? How? Could it have been foretold, prevented? My previous life receded. I was only this, a body on a bed. Why should anyone want to harm me? I was disappearing anyway. And one of the things that the family uses throughout their time in hiding is the bus system. These trams. And this is a picture taken from the set of Jacob the Liar, which was set in Budapest during the war. I had the pleasure this summer of getting to hear Nahama Tech speak. She was born in Lublin in Poland in 1931. She's an academic who's devoted her career to studying aspects of genocide and the Holocaust. Her father's chemical factory was taken over by the Nazis in 1939, but the German commissioner in charge of the factory allowed her father to continue to work. And when the family was finally forced to leave their home, they moved into a room in the factory. By the time that Lublin was proclaimed free of Jews in 1942, the family obtained false papers and traveled to Warsaw by train. After a few weeks there, she and her sister moved in with a Christian family in rural Otwock, about a half or an hour train ride away. And her family then moved to Kilichi and lived with another branch of the same Christian family until the end of the war. But during this transition, she was left on her own in Otwock and was extremely frightened that she'd never see her family again. In Kilichi, the two girls posed as visiting nieces while their parents were not officially alive. The parents remained hidden. Nahama, known as Krysia, eventually sold bread on the black market to augment the family's finances. They complied with the wishes of the family that had hidden them and left Kilichi without revealing that they were Jews. Their protectors did not want friends and neighbors to know that they'd helped a Jewish family to survive, and their reasons for doing it were economic. The family kept giving them money, which is some of why this young girl ended up selling bread on the black market, to be able to continue to pay for essentially their survival and room and board. When she returned to Lublin in 1945 after the war, she felt like a stranger in her hometown, which really reminded me of the way Lillian talked about returning home and being told this is no longer your house. She writes, and eventually I grew oddly accustomed to anti-Semitic remarks. A slow transformation was taking place in me. It was as if, in certain circumstances, I lost track of who I really was and began to see myself as a Pole. I became a double person. Remember, we were dealing with this issue of doubling in Waller? One private and one public. I liked my new name. Feeling and believing myself to be Krysia Block made life easier, and I felt less threatened when Jews were mentioned. These inconsistent and powerful emotions continued to battle within me, and I did nothing to reverse the process. In part, I did not know how to reverse it, and in part, I did not want to. Life moved on, and I became increasingly absorbed into my surroundings, and as I did, I offered less and less resistance to what was happening to me. She goes on later, and again as before, I felt an odd confusion of emotions, fear because I was losing touch with my real self, but a kind of pleasure too, because it was so easy to give up and become my newer, safer self. And one of the things that I've been most interested in is what does it take after the war to recover that old self after one has been passing for something different, when one has integrated that into their being. I just want to mention two voices of people who escaped Nazi tyranny. One very famous one, Nellie Sachs, who got the Pulitzer, actually the Nobel Prize for her writing. She was born in 1891 in Berlin and remained largely ignorant of Jewish tradition and religion well into her adult years. In the mid-1930s, she became an active member of the Jewish Cultural Association in Berlin. After Kristallnacht, in November 1938, she tried to find a place of refuge for herself and her mother. Sweden was a logical choice, and most of us know why. Where did the Danish Jews end up going? So it was a safe place during the war, for Jews at least. And since the age of 15, she'd been corresponding with a Swedish novelist, Selma Lagerlöf. Just as the tension and danger was reaching nearly unbearable proportions, she had already received her deportation papers. The visas arrived, and she and her mother were able to escape in May of 1940 on the last flight from Berlin to Stockholm. In 1943, she learned of her lover's death, as well as the deportation of Jews to Auschwitz. She was filled with sorrow and despair about the fate of friends and relatives, feelings mingled with a sense of guilt at having escaped their fate, and turned to her poetry as a vehicle for bearing witness to the memories of the dead and an instrument of mourning. In May of 1970, 1 month after a friend and kindred poetic spirit, Paul Celan, had committed suicide in Paris, she died of natural causes. My mother held me by my hand. Then someone raised the knife of parting so that it should not strike me. My mother loosed her hand from mine, and she lightly touched my thighs once more, and her hand was bleeding. After the knife of parting cut in two each bite I swallowed, it rose before me with the sun at dawn and began to sharpen itself in my eyes. Wind and water ground in my ear, and every voice of comfort pierced my heart. As I was led to death, I felt in the last moment the unsheathing of the great knife of parting. And we can understand this, obviously, in all the texts that have taught us about the cruelties of children being separated during actions or during the roll calls or during the arrivals by train. When she got the Nobel Prize, the person giving her this amazing honor said, "Your lyrical and dramatic writing now belongs to the great laments of literature." Remember, we've heard this word lament and lamentation in a number of ways. But the feeling of mourning which inspired you is free from hate and lends sublimity to the suffering of man. We honor you today as the bearer of a message of solace to all those who despair of the fate of man. At the very end of the semester, we'll have a chance to meet people like Karen Gershon, who were saved as a result of the Kindertransport, where children were taken from Germany and other countries, but predominantly Germany, to England with just a little suitcase and no other possessions, just clothes. The vast majority of them never to see their families again. Gershon was born in 1923 in Westphalia in Germany, an assimilated German Jewish child. 5 weeks after Kristallnacht, Käthe, which was her given name, and her sister Lisa were sent by their parents on a Kindertransport to England. Her 17-year-old sister left for Palestine before war broke out. So in essence, throughout the war, she was alone with just adopted parents. Her parents were deported to the Riga ghetto, and her father died of a weak heart, and her mother was shot. Having previously anglicized her name to Karen, Kata assumed as her written name in writing of Karen Gershon, Gershon being her father's Hebrew name meaning stranger in a strange land. She was driven by a survivor's sense of guilt. She felt it her duty to bear witness. The terrible past is not an adversary, but my greatest asset. I will not fight against it, but put it to work. I cannot alter what has happened, but by making a tool of it, I can at least give it a purpose. And not only did she write quite a volume of poetry, but also worked to collect the stories of the child survivors in a very interesting collage. It's no one person's voice is heard. It's her compilation of all of the voices. I was not there. The morning they set out from home, I was not there to comfort them. The dawn was innocent with snow, in mockery. It is not true. The dawn was neutral, was immune. Their shadows threaded it too soon. They were relieved that it had come. It was not there to comfort them. One told me that my father spent a day in prison long ago. He did not tell me that he went. What difference does it make now, when he set out, when he came home? I was not there to comfort him, and now I have no means to know of what I was kept ignorant. Both my parents died in camps. I was not there to comfort them. I was not there. They were alone. My mind refuses to conceive the life, the death they must have known. I must atone because I live. I could not have saved them from death. The ground is neutral underneath. Every child must leave its home. Time gathers life impartially. I should have spared them nothing, since I was too young. It is not true. They might have lived to succor me, and none shall say in my defense that had I been there to comfort them, it would have made no difference. I've probably given you lots and lots of voices of children and teenagers who survived. Do you see any common threads in the work that we've been looking at? Any themes that you see? Lamentation. For some, guilt. Any others? Think about it as I keep going. We're almost done. Yeah, Katie.
I think I see a lot about family.
Family? Loss? Yeah. Okay, keep that in mind. We'll come back to it. Not only do we have the voices of those who lived and died during this time period in the area that was primarily the focus of Nazi tyranny, but we have voices of those who were contemporaries living outside the sphere of Nazi tyranny in England and in the United States and other places in the world. And most of us have read Cynthia Ozick's The Shawl. She wrestles with the moral dilemma of writing about the Holocaust. She was born in New York of Russian Jewish immigrants. Her own youth was marred by taunts of public school classmates calling her a Christ killer, and because she refused to sing Christmas carols at school assemblies. And those of us who went to public school in New York, regardless of religion, were expected to sing Christmas carols. It was something that was done. And if you chose not to sing, you marked yourself as different. So I really resonate with that. out of my own experience. And we remember this scene at the very end. Where the mother stands for an instant at the margin of the arena. Sometimes the electricity inside the fence would seem to hum. Even Stella said it was only imagining, but Rosa heard real sounds in the wire, grainy, sad voices. The shawl marks the sole instance that Ozick locates her fiction, and she's a very prolific writer of fiction, within a concentration camp universe. Her story opens in the middle of the scene, focusing on two young women, sisters, and an infant on a death march en route from one concentration camp to another, and dwells on choiceless choices in this universe that they're living in. In a way, the shawl assumes kind of magical properties, serving as the infant Magda's daily source of shelter, nourishment, and concealment. Looking for the shawl that her 14-year-old Aunt Stella has usurped to warm her own frozen body, Magda toddles into the roll call square, crying, uttering her first sound since Rosa's breast dried up. In the climactic scene, as Magda reaches toward Mother and the retrieved shawl, a German guard sweeps the infant up and tosses her on the electrified fence. The witnessing mother crams the shawl into her own mouth to mute her grief, once again affirming the life-preserving properties of the shawl. And I hope we'll all have a chance to talk more about this story in section on Thursday. The other voice is a very, it's an important one to me because, like Pages, Fainlight is able to capture in a very short bit of poetry a huge amount. Her parents were from Austria-Hungary, her father from Poland. She had an interesting, circuitous life, being born in the Bronx, and then her family went back to England in the 30s, which is where she lived. To avoid the Blitz in London, which is when the Germans were doing fairly constant bombardment, her mother rented rooms in a house in a family of miners in South Wales. Couldn't be further away from an urban environment. I first became conscious of myself as an alien and a Jew. No Jew had ever lived there, and probably none of the inhabitants had ever met one, which did not stop the usual prejudices from flowing and flourishing. Archive film material. At first it seemed a swaying field of flowers, wind-blown, beside a railway track. But then I saw it was the turning heads of men unloading from the cattle trucks at Auschwitz. And you could almost see a camera lens going from a softer focus, and we know the kind of soft focus at the end of the Diary of Anne Frank in that original edition of the beauty, and then you focus in and seeing people who are probably marching to their death. So how she's captured this small moment. We now move from the past, which we've dwelled on at length, to the present, to the voices of those who were born after 1945. Many of them children of survivors. In his study of the writings of descendants of Jewish Holocaust survivors, Melvin Boukiet says, memory is the mantra of all the institutions that reckon with the Holocaust. But memory is an inaccurate term for anyone who wasn't there, on either side of the barbed wire, Jew or German. Thinking about the Holocaust is really an act of the imagination. All we know is how little we know. The only reason the German killed the Jews was because they wanted to. Why? Because. The Holocaust is a black hole that devours light. The more illumination cast upon it, the less you see. The other thing you learn is that you can't realistically render it. If you place yourself in the mass grave, you can't quite drag yourself out of it either. As one writer said, I inherited a suffering to which I had not been subjected. For without having to endure oppression, the identity of the victim was mine. The allotment was inescapable. For them, utter abandonment and anonymous death, and for their spokesperson, sympathy and honor. I owed to the bond of blood this intoxicating power to confuse myself with the martyrs. No trace of them remains, except perhaps my taste for poppy seed bread, scorching hot tea, and the way I hold sugar in my teeth rather than let it dissolve. In other words, how do you cope with the most important events of your life having occurred before you were born? What does this do to your sense of time, of authenticity? And Lily Brett and Savion Liebrecht really help us understand this. She was born in Germany, raised in Australia. Her parents spent most of the war in the Lodz ghetto, which is where Lucille Eichengreen was, and briefer internments in Auschwitz and Stutthof. She was born in a displaced persons camp in Germany. And we'll look at just one poem. I keep forgetting the facts and statistics, and each time I need to know them, I look up books. These books line 12 shelves in my room. I know where to go to confirm the fact, and in the Warsaw Ghetto, there were 7.2 people per room, and in Lodz, they allocated 5.8 people to each room. I forget over and over again that 1/3 of Warsaw was Jewish, and in the ghetto, they crammed 500,000 Jews into 2.4% of the area of the city, and how many bodies they were burning in Auschwitz at the peak of their production. 12,000 a day. I have to check and recheck. And did I dream that at 4 p.m. on the 19th of January, 58,000 emaciated inmates were marched out of Auschwitz? Was I right to remember that in Bergen-Belsen, from the 4th to the 13th of April 1945, 28,000 Jews arrived from other camps? I can remember hundreds and hundreds of phone numbers. Phone numbers I haven't phoned for 20 years are readily accessible. And I can remember people's conversations and what someone's wife said to someone else's husband. What a good memory you have, people tell me. In a way, this poem is a relentless reminder to maintain this inventory of life and death in the camps that it is so insurmountable in its detail that it's hard to hold on to. We'll skip this one. And we've all been reading Hayuta's Engagement Party. And hopefully we'll have time to talk about the ending of it on Thursday in section. Liebrecht was born in Germany to Holocaust survivors and emigrated to Israel as an infant. Her parents met in a displaced persons camp. They tried under cover of silence to shelter their children from the horrors they'd experienced. Liebrecht says, the influence of the Holocaust on my work cannot be separated from the influence of the Holocaust on my life. The very subjects which trouble you and inspire you and haunt you as a person are those which are, in all sorts of disguises, going to reveal themselves in your work. And since the Holocaust is the event which, more than any other, has left its marks on my life, it has become a subject of my work. The tension in her writing reveals the pain she experienced as a child of survivors, one born into the Holocaust to parents who were broken, who'd lost everything, including their language, their cultural background, and their optimisms. The younger generation's disinterest in the survivor generation's story is evocative of the conspiracy of silence of a disinterested world that for very many years didn't really want to hear. As we remember Lucille saying, no one wanted to hear it. They wanted me to go on with my life. And so to focus in on the story of the family who does not want to hear Grandpa Mendel's story, they shut their ears. They let him talk, blocking the path to their hearts. Whenever he rose to his feet and lifted his right arm with the goblet in his hand, they knew that the moment had arrived. Had her father forgotten the death and the fear and the hunger? How would he lock them in his heart and never mention them for 40 years? And now, how had his locked memories awakened in him in the presence of all the abundance and the songs and the conciliatory atmosphere that permeates the illuminated rooms on holidays? And I know that we already have some discussion questions focusing on this, and I hope we'll spend some time on Thursday really looking in more depth at the story. I wanted to end with an unusual voice, Hans-Jörg Stahlschmidt. And he's a psychologist and poet who grew up in Germany in the shadow of the war, the child of a Nazi. And I wish we had more examples of this kind of writing to balance the enormous wealth of writing that we have of Holocaust survivors, for those who are influenced by the Holocaust and by the children of the survivors. He says, when I grew older and went to the university, I, like many students, got involved in fighting patriarchy. Our father's generation had destroyed half the world and brought shame to our country, and we were very angry about it. But over time, I got a different perspective on history. I saw old photos of my father when he was drafted, and I could see how young he looked. He was only 18. My father had dreams of becoming a musician, and they were all destroyed by the war. I started developing more empathy for my father and stopped looking at him from such a black and white point of view. Through my own experience as a parent, I became aware of the incredible sacrifices my parents had made for me. If you could lick my heart. There is no bridge back from Auschwitz, back to the world. We made it up. We try to find tales of good and heroic triumph. We attach hooks and ropes to the bottomless abyss of evil. But the ones who survived helplessly watching their brother or child murdered were never again at home in the world. Primo Levi, Tadeusz Borowski, Jean Amri, Paul Celan, the list is longer than Schindler's. So let us be careful to know that we are the ones who were not there, that we are the ones who put words where there was nothing, put a light where there was only an unending starless night, put hope in that place where human hair piled up to a mountain of despair, which God's hand never crushed, but remained motionless behind the smoke-filled clouds. Our imagining can barely touch the outer reaches of those experiences, but it allows us to dilute the deadly waters of that truth. You asked me for my impressions, Itzhak Zuckerman, a leader of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, replied. If you could lick my heart, it would poison you. So what will the future hold? As we hear the voices of the third generation of the Holocaust, of survivors of other genocides, of the survivors of genocides that have occurred since the Holocaust. What will be the moral dilemmas, the choiceless choices? How will that mourning and lamentation show its face? What will be the impact of passing as someone different than who you really are? How will we explore the determination to live and bear witness? How will families be affected? The generations, not just the ones directly impacted. What will be the legacies, personal, professional, societal, of survival? Will there still be memories kept alive by the children of survivors, by the children of perpetrators? I just wanted to end with some images of Armenia, Rwanda, and the genocide in Darfur that we'll be so privileged next week to hear Jerry Fowler speak about. Thank you. Questions? I've kept you a long time today. Christine.
Well, you talked about survivor's guilt, and we heard so much about how there's so many survivors who try to pretend that their experience when they were younger never happened. And then we have these writers who feel compelled to write about it. And I was just curious what you think about the motives, that make people write about the Holocaust and their experience, and why they feel they can do it.
The motivations vary enormously from person to person. And for many, it's to finally tell the story. Many people were influenced when we started having Holocaust deniers say the Holocaust didn't happen, and they felt a real compunction. As people get older, it's natural as part of the aging process to want to share your story. I don't know how many times my father told me the same 5 or 6 important stories about his life. And the frequency increased the closer he got to 90. And so the key here is the need to tell, and also, as you remember last week, when people finally ask you to tell the story, when there's somebody who actually wants to hear it, those can all be factors, and I imagine there are plenty more that I haven't touched on. And there are others who are affected by it, by the legacy, who say, if I was born in Europe 70 years ago, what would my life have been like? Would I have even been born? And if I were born, how long would I have lived? So it's the other part of it is putting yourself in the shoes of those who've experienced it and trying to walk with them. And I think as we've been grappling with this study of perpetrators, to try to understand what propelled people there, what could have caused them to do those acts of extraordinary evil. I think when one starts learning about the Holocaust, there are different things that pull us. And depending on our orientation, if we're a literature major, you're going to play with poetry like I do, and sociological studies. Many are interested in the psychological underpinnings. Others are interested in the play of history. Each of us come to it with our own perspectives. Other questions? Thank you so much for listening so intently. Is that another question? Why don't you come up? So I think people are beginning to filter out, so let's not lose the question.